Imagine the final judgment arriving. Not a metaphor, a literal unmaking of the world, and everyone you've ever known swept into it. Everyone except a handful of people who were marked for survival before any of it began. The Book of Enoch, an ancient text the church spent centuries burying, says this group exists. It names them, and it names the single reason the rest weren't spared while they were. It isn't luck. It isn't location. It's older than the sun itself. By the end, you'll know exactly what separates the two. Enoch gets exactly 2 verses in Genesis before he disappears. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No death recorded, no burial, no grave anyone could point to. Every other name in that chapter closes the same way. He lived, he had children, he died. Enoch is the single break in the pattern, the one man whose story ends without an ending. And the text never explains it. It simply moves on, as if a man vanishing without dying were an ordinary way to close a paragraph. For most of history, that was the whole story. 2 verses, then silence. But sometime between the 3rd and 2nd century BC, a set of writings began circulating through Judea, claiming to be Enoch's own record of what happened during that missing time. A first-hand account of visions he received before he was taken. Heaven opened to him. He watched a group of angels called the Watchers descend to earth and corrupt humanity. He was shown a courtroom at the end of history, complete with a verdict already written. And running through nearly every page of it is one repeated promise. A specific group of people present at that final judgment who cannot be swept away by what's happening around them. This promise is worth taking seriously instead of dismissing as ancient folklore, because Enoch wasn't some obscure scroll nobody in the Bible ever touched. The Book of Jude, sitting inside the New Testament right now, quotes Enoch by name, word for word. Enoch also, the 7th from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints." That's direct attribution. An author reaching for Enoch's authority the way you'd cite a source you expected your audience to already trust. For roughly 300 years, early Christian communities read Enoch alongside the writings that would eventually become the New Testament. Then later, church councils began narrowing the canon down to the 66 books most Western Christians use today. Skeptics are right that the popular claim about one council voting Enoch out by name doesn't hold up. The real story is messier. A centuries-long drift away from the text rather than a single dramatic ban. But the outcome is the same either way. The book early Christians treated as scripture-adjacent for generations quietly stopped being copied in the West and survived complete in only one place, Ethiopia, inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which never removed it from the canon. That history matters for the question this video is asking. Because Enoch doesn't open his book with angels or monsters. He opens with a blessing, a direct address to a group he calls the elect and the righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation when all the wicked and godless are to be removed. He isn't writing general moral advice for whoever happens to pick up the scroll. He's addressing a specific group of people who don't exist yet, about a specific moment that hasn't happened yet, a day when the wicked are being actively removed from the earth while one group is left standing. That's the difference between a fortune cookie and a letter with your name already on the envelope, sealed centuries before you were born. A few sentences later, Enoch tells us what happens to that named group when the tribulation arrives. The mountains melt like wax before the flame. The earth is rent asunder. Judgment falls on everyone except one group. But with the righteous he will make peace, and will protect the elect, and mercy shall be upon them. Protect, not comfort promised for some distant afterlife. Protect in the moment, during the catastrophe leveling everything around them. That's a promise about surviving the worst day in human history while it is happening, not merely about what comes after. Most people read a line like that as generic religious comfort, the kind of sentiment you'd find embroidered on a pillow. God protects the good people. But that reading misses the detail that makes the passage strange. A promise of protection only means something if the threat could otherwise get through. You don't hand a bulletproof vest to someone standing nowhere near a gun. If Enoch has to go out of his way this early to specifically promise the elect will be shielded, that tells you something uncomfortable about whatever they're being shielded from. It's close enough and powerful enough to reach them without that protection. And that raises the real question. If a hidden few were set apart to survive, then something was actively coming for everyone else. Enoch spends the rest of the book naming exactly what that something is. The something is named in the opening section, the part scholars call the Book of the Watchers. It isn't the Antichrist by that word, because that word belongs to a much later Christian vocabulary that didn't exist yet. It's the pattern underneath the word. A group of angels led by a figure named Azazel who abandon heaven, descend to earth, and teach humanity forbidden knowledge, weapon making, sorcery, cosmetics used for seduction, the tools of manipulation and domination. Their offspring become a race of giants who devastate the planet before the flood wipes the slate clean. It's the blueprint every final tyrant narrative gets built from afterward, including the beast in Revelation and the figure later Christian tradition names the Antichrist. Enoch isn't using our vocabulary for that figure. He's naming the mechanism it runs on: corruption, false knowledge, seized dominion, and an ongoing attempt to reach and control people who belong to someone else. The story gets specific in a way most people scrolling past a Bible verse never catch, because Enoch doesn't stop at the elect, are protected, and move on. A few chapters later, during a vision of paradise, Enoch is shown a tree, fragrant, glowing, standing at the summit of a mountain shaped like a throne, and he's told point blank by the archangel Michael that no mortal is permitted to touch it till the great judgment. That's not forbidden by rule, the way a roped-off museum exhibit is forbidden. It's physically off limits, reserved for a future moment, when it will finally be given to the righteous. Enoch keeps returning to that exact word, untouchable, first applied to a tree and later to a group of human beings. And that pairing is not a coincidence. In the second major section of the book, a portion scholars call the parables, the text stops speaking in vague poetry about the wicked and introduces a specific enemy. A recurring group Enoch calls the kings and the mighty. The moment they enter the story, the stakes shift, because these aren't fallen angels hiding in the shadows anymore. They're rulers. Human power at its peak, sitting on thrones, backed by armies, convinced that nothing on earth could be beyond their reach. This is where it gets uncomfortable for anyone reading this as pure allegory. Biblical scholar George Nicholsburg, one of the most cited academic authorities on 1st Enoch, notes that the enemies in this section aren't described as Satan or monsters or some purely symbolic evil. They're described as corrupt political and religious elites, men whose power rests upon their riches, who deny the Lord of Spirits outright, and who actively persecute the faithful. So Enoch's Antichrist figure was never written as a single individual with horns waiting in some distant future. It's a pattern of earthly power that recurs across history. A throne, a system, a ruling class that positions itself above judgment and treats every human being underneath it as reachable. That's a more unsettling threat than a lone supernatural villain, because the pattern doesn't need one apocalyptic figure to arrive on schedule. It just needs power concentrated in the wrong hands at the wrong moment. Something history has produced more than once already. This brings the story to chapter 62, where Enoch shows exactly this kind of ruler reaching for the set-apart few and failing in real time. The Lord of Spirits addresses the kings and the mighty directly, almost mockingly. Open your eyes and lift up your horns if ye are able to recognize the elect one. It's a dare. Try to see him. Try to touch what belongs to him. What happens next isn't a battle. It's a collapse. Pain shall seize them, Enoch writes, the same pain as a woman in labor. The moment a birth becomes irreversible, their faces go downcast. They can't even hold a direct gaze on the thing they came to reach. The most powerful men on earth, the ones who spent entire reigns believing dominion meant untouchability, discover in that moment that the untouchable ones were never them. Then it gets worse for them, fast. These same kings and mighty don't just fail to reach the elect, they end up on their knees in front of them. Enoch writes that they fall down before him on their faces, and worship, and set their hope upon that Son of Man, and petition him, and supplicate for mercy at his hands. The figure who spent the narrative functioning as the threat ends the story begging the very people he once had the power to persecute, and the charge against him isn't abstract. Enoch states the reason for his punishment directly. He is delivered over to the angels for vengeance, because they have oppressed his children and his elect. The attempt to touch them is what condemns him, not some separate sin committed elsewhere. The reaching itself is the crime. This is worth slowing down on, because most people assume set apart to survive means something close to a magic force field, a glowing dome, a visible barrier the tyrant slams into and bounces off. Enoch's version is stranger than that, and arguably scarier for the tyrant than for anyone standing behind that supposed shield. The untouchability isn't a wall he runs into. It's a mismatch in category. He's reaching for something that was never within his jurisdiction to begin with. The same way you can't steal something that was never for sale. Remember that tree. The one no mortal was permitted to touch until judgment. It wasn't guarded by a fence or a weapon. It was simply reserved, set apart for an owner who hadn't formally claimed it yet. And there's a second reversal buried earlier that makes the pattern harder to dismiss as coincidence. Back in the Book of the Watchers, Azazel, the angel Enoch blames for teaching humanity the arts of weapons and seduction, doesn't get destroyed outright. He gets bound. The archangel Raphael is ordered to tie him hand and foot, throw him into a pit in the desert, and cover him with darkness till the day of the great judgment. The same untouchable language, flipped upside down. The tree no mortal could touch until judgment. The elect no tyrant could touch until judgment. And now Azazel himself, rendered unable to touch anyone, sealed away until that same day. In Enoch's world, access was never about who was strongest in the moment. It was about who had already lost the right to move freely, centuries in advance. Which leaves the one question everything has been circling. Why these people? Why were they spared and not the rest? Enoch answers it in the strangest chapter in the book. In chapter 48 of 1st Enoch, the text takes a turn almost no casual reader expects. Up to this point, the elect has sounded like a description of behavior, the righteous, the holy, the people who did the right things and were rewarded for it. But here, Enoch reveals that their status was never primarily about behavior. It was about something that happened before behavior was even possible. Before the world existed, Enoch describes a figure called the Son of Man standing beside the Head of Days, an ancient title for God, and then delivers the line that reframes everything. Before the sun and the signs were created, before the stars of the heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of Spirits. It wasn't chosen later, after some cosmic conflict decided the winners. It wasn't appointed once the story was already in motion. He was named before time itself had a starting point. And a few lines later, Enoch tells us what that name does for the people who belong to it. For in his name they are saved. That's the reason the hidden few were spared. Not a spell, not an amulet, not a magic circle drawn on the ground at the last second. A name spoken before creation that determines in advance who cannot be reached. That detail changes the meaning of everything you've heard. If the elect's survival depended on their own strength, their own hiding, their own cleverness, a powerful enough tyrant could eventually find a way through. Enough resources, enough time, enough brute force applied in the right place. But Enoch isn't describing a defense that can be worn down. He's describing an ownership that predates the attacker entirely. The kings and the mighty in chapter 62 aren't failing to touch the elect because the elect happen to be stronger in that moment. They're failing because they're reaching for something already spoken for by a name older than the sun, long before those kings ever drew their first breath. The set-apart few were never available to be taken in the first place. And Enoch tells us something even stranger. The elect themselves didn't fully understand what protected them until it was revealed to them. Chapter 48 says the wisdom of the Lord of Spirits revealed him to the holy and righteous, meaning even they weren't born already knowing the name that saved them. It had to be shown to them. The way you can't claim a room key you don't know exists. That means the line separating the spared from everyone else was never a bloodline, a nationality, or a club you're automatically born into. It was alignment with a name spoken before the world existed, revealed to whoever was willing to receive it once it was shown. Enoch doesn't call this figure the Son of Man once and move on, either. Across these chapters he's also called the Elect One, the Chosen One, and most tellingly, the Concealed One. A title that shows up again and again because he's meant to stay hidden until the moment judgment requires him to be revealed. That matters, because the spared aren't described as carrying a visible mark a tyrant could scan for and target. No brand on the skin. No symbol stitched into clothing. Their protection is bound up in something concealed, the same way the name protecting them was concealed, which is why no amount of surveillance, force, or searching could ever locate it in advance. It's worth pausing on how closely this maps onto a scene many viewers already know from a different book. The sealing of the servants of God in the Book of Revelation, marked on the forehead before judgment falls, untouchable to the forces unleashed afterward. Enoch was written centuries before Revelation, and scholars are careful to note these aren't the same texts describing the same event. but the shared architecture is hard to miss. A name or a mark assigned before disaster strikes, invisible to the naked eye, yet the deciding factor in who the coming judgment can and cannot reach. Two different books, centuries apart, reaching for the same image. Apparently the only way either author knew how to describe something that isn't physical but still functions like a wall. Chapter 62 closes the loop on what that alignment buys them. The righteous and elect shall be saved on that day, and they shall never thenceforward see the face of the sinners and unrighteous. That's not a temporary reprieve, it's a permanent separation. The tyrant who once had the power to reach into their lives is removed from their reality entirely, not just defeated, erased from their field of vision forever. That's why they were spared, and the rest weren't. Not because they fought harder, because they were standing inside something the destruction had no authority over. So the question this video opened with was, never really will the tribulation reach me. It's whether you're standing inside the name Enoch says was spoken before the stars, or standing on the open ground the kings and the mighty occupied, reaching for something that was never theirs to take. Untouchability, according to Enoch, was never a shield you put on the moment danger arrives. It was an identity you were already standing inside, whether you understood it yet or not, and it had to be revealed. The elect had to be shown, which means the line between spared and lost was never fixed at birth. It was drawn by whether you aligned yourself with something that existed before the world did. If that unsettles you a little, it should. Because Enoch doesn't stop at who survives the tribulation while it's happening. He goes further into a question most people never think to ask. What happens to a soul in the moments right after death? Long before any tribulation, long before any judgment scene plays out, according to Enoch, that part of the story hides a trap most souls walk straight into without ever realizing it happened. Being set apart to survive the end of the world means nothing if you're unprepared for what's waiting on the other side of your own. That's the question the next video answers.